Oh, because everybody's on mute.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being with us today, and I'm Missy Jenkins, and I serve as Vice President of Public Policy at the Alliance for Aging Research and Executive Director of the Accelerate Cure and Treatments for Alzheimer's Disease, or ACTD Coalition. On behalf of the Coalition, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on Alzheimer's disease clinical trial recruitment. We will hear from the National Institute on Aging at NIH, and also from two of our ACT-AD industry partners, Biogen and Eli Lilly, on the challenges of patient recruitment, strategies for overcoming those challenges, and ways to collaborate to overcome recruitment and retention issues for Alzheimer's disease studies. I'll be your moderator for today's program, but first I'd like to give those who may be joining us for the first time some background on ACT-AD Coalition. ACT-AD is a coalition of more than 50 national nonprofit organizations, 11 industry partners, and several leading research and regulatory expert advisors working with urgency to speed up the development of a potential cure and more effective treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Since 2006, ACT-AD has brought its diverse expertise to bear on critical regulatory issues in Alzheimer's disease clinical development and research at the FDA and NIH, and more recently on coverage concerns at CMS. The primary federal agency supporting and conducting Alzheimer's disease and related dementias research at NIH is the NIA. Since 2014, NIA's AD and ADRD funding has dramatically increased to support basic, translational, and clinical research, including a significant increase in clinical trials, which we will focus on today. Clinical trial recruitment overall has been a long-standing challenge for both the public and private research community. The large public funding increases for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias in particular has brought the issue of trial recruitment to a critical point. We are seeing in real time that more research dollars does not necessarily translate to more people coming to sign up for research studies. The NIA has partnered with a wide range of stakeholders, particularly those underrepresented in research, to develop a comprehensive national strategy for Alzheimer's disease clinical trial recruitment and participation. NIA is reaching out to ACT-AD to help inform its strategy and implementation. We're fortunate to have experts joining us from the NIA, Melissa McGowan and Jennifer Watson, to present on this new strategy. Now I'm going to take on a few housekeeping items. Our speakers from the NIA will present for about 20 minutes, followed by our distinguished industry experts who will present for 10 minutes each. There will be a Q&A period at the end of the program, so as you think of questions, you can feel free to use the WebEx chat function, and I will add them to the Q&A queue. We are recording today's program, and the recording and all of the presentations that get approved for posting will be available 1 or 2 weeks after the webinar on our website, act-ad.org. I'd like to thank my colleagues for their help in planning the program, including Alliance President and CEO Sue Peshin, Public Policy Associate Ryan Carney, and Development Manager Sarah Giovani. I'd like to recognize ACT-AD sponsors, Anavex, Avenir, Axovant, Biogen, ACI, Eli Lilly and Company, Genentech, Janssen, Lundbeck, Merck, Otsuka. Without your generosity, programs like the one today would not be possible. Thank you for your partnership. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our first speakers from the National Institute of Aging. Melissa McGowan, Chief of Outreach and Education within the Office of Communications and Public Liaison, and Jennifer Watson, Deputy Director and Chief of Content, also within the Office of Communications and Public Liaison. Melissa is responsible for managing all aspects for media and press inquiries and outreach for the Institute for campaigns in aging, exercise, Alzheimer's disease, and brain health. Jennifer oversees the development and production of web and digital media content, print materials and video, as well as outreach to consumer audience. We're very, very fortunate to have you both joining us today, and I'm going to pull up your slides and you can take it away.
Great, thanks, Missy. This is Melissa McGowan, and just a special thank you on behalf of myself and Jennifer and NIA for the opportunity to talk to you all about a project that has been near and dear to our hearts here, and we've been working hard on it for some time now, and that is the National Strategy for Recruitment and Participation in Alzheimer's Disease Clinical Research. So the way I'm going to go through the first couple of slides and give you kind of the history and the background on the strategy and kind of bring you up to where we are, and then Jennifer's going to take over and talk a little bit about where we are planning to be in the next couple of months. So if we go ahead to the next slide, I think as Missy mentioned in her introductory comments, I think we all know recruitment and retention for clinical studies continues to be a significant challenge for us, particularly, as Missy mentioned, now that there is this unprecedented interest in Alzheimer's disease research, including increases in the appropriations that we have received over the last couple of years. And so we are working hard to try and address some of those challenges, and we're thinking about this as comprehensively as we can. So what are the things that we can do to address some of the challenges, including the eligibility criteria? I think you all know that for clinical studies, rigorous clinical studies, there are strict eligibility criteria that can lead to fewer participants being able to be enrolled in a clinical study. Research has now taken us in the direction that we know we need to be reaching participants who in earlier stages of the disease or who may be at risk. And so how do we reach those folks who may cognitively be unimpaired, but we still want to enroll them and get them involved in clinical studies? One of the things I think that you will hear, and we'd be interested in getting some feedback and people's thoughts on this too, is how best to engage primary care providers and healthcare providers in helping us increase awareness and understanding, and what resources are available out there to help facilitate recruitment into clinical studies. And then, of course, with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, oftentimes there are the study partner requirements. To even get into a clinical study, you have to go through some invasive and time-consuming procedures. So that's just kind of setting the stage for some of the challenges that we've been thinking about. The next slide, please. I think you all are aware, I hope, of the National Plan to Address Alzheimer's Disease. This plan stemmed out of the National Alzheimer's Project Act that was passed in 2011. And as part of that plan, recruitment was a specific piece that was included so that it would rise to the level of importance that we all know that it needs. So as part of the national plan, there are several milestones, and recruitment, you can see on the slide, recruitment is reflected in some of those milestones. So the strategy that we are working on is designed to help reach some of those, help us get to some of those milestones. So next slide, please. So you can see here for our national strategy, we have some broad goals, and the idea is to really increase the segments of the public, the communities who participate in clinical studies, and with a specific emphasis on some of the underrepresented communities. We really want to figure out the best ways and the best strategies, those that have worked and those that we need to develop to help people, wide swaths of the population, understand clinical studies, participate in clinical studies, and also remain and be and continue to participate in those clinical studies. The next slide, please. And when we started to think about the national strategy, we had a steering committee, and we worked with the steering committee to think about what are the main areas of focus that we really want to address. And you can see that those areas of focus were distilled down into how do we best increase awareness and engagement kind of at a broader national level. What are the kinds of things that we need to do to build and improve the current clinical studies infrastructure and the capacity of sites to help facilitate recruitment and retention? And how do we engage those local communities, particularly the underrepresented communities, as I mentioned before, and how can we support that participation? And another piece that we are also working on here at NIA is to develop the science of recruitment. What are some of the things that we need to better understand and can we look at in a rigorous way to help build this science base for recruitment strategies? So next slide, please. So you can see this has been a work in progress based on the timeline. We brought together a group of a small group of stakeholders at the AAIC meeting in Toronto in 2016, and from there that really helped start us moving towards the development of this national strategy. Following that meeting, we held a meeting of those same stakeholders and a few more groups in December of 2016. And from that meeting, that's where that steering committee that I mentioned was established. And with the steering committee's help and with facilitation from the Alzheimer's Association, we developed some working groups to really focus on on those areas that I mentioned before, kind of the national efforts on awareness, the capacity building, and the working with local and diverse communities. So that all started in the winter of 2017. The work groups got right to work and started thinking about each of their sections. We brought them together here on the NIH campus in April of 2017 to talk about where those working groups were, what kinds of strategies, what kinds of things they were thinking about in terms of recruitment, and so that they could all have a dialogue about the things they were thinking about. Those working groups then left that meeting and took some time to really develop the strategies and the methods that they would like to see reflected in the national strategy. And then in March and April of 2018, and I hope everybody had a chance to see this, we had a public comment period where we used the idea scale platform to do a crowdsourcing platform to get public input on the strategies that the working groups had come up with. And the goal is to finalize the strategy, get some additional input, and finalize the strategy at the end of the summer. So next slide, please. And so just a little bit about the public comment and the crowdsourcing platform that we use. What we really wanted to do was to get some additional ideas and to hear people's comments and thoughts about where the strategy was to date. We were very gratified about the response that we got. We took the strategy as it had been drafted, and we kind of chunked it up into about 85 different ideas from all of those working groups, and we put it on this platform and opened it up for public comment. And people could submit ideas, new ideas, they could comment on the current ideas, They could vote for the ideas that they liked, and we were really thrilled with the participation that we received. More than 1,000 people either voted or posted ideas or submitted comments. And from the original 85 that were posted, we ended up with more than 200 additional ideas and 150 comments that either, were extensions of some of the ideas or a new way to think about some of the strategies and ideas that we had already thought about as part of the working group and as part of the strategy. And I think what we heard loud and clear is the voice of the community. We had a lot of participants and caregivers who participated and submitted comments, and very specifically were interested in letting us know about the kinds of information that they needed, how we might best promote participation in research, and interestingly, a lot of support for making sure that people receive their individual data and study results after they have participated. So this was the first time that we in our office had used this kind of crowdsourcing platform, and I think we were very, very gratified. We've gone through the data, and Jennifer's going to talk about that for a little bit, but it took the better part of a month to kind of sort through all of those comments that we very, very happily received. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jennifer, and she can talk a little bit more about where we hope to go with the strategy.
Thanks, Melissa, and good morning, everybody. This is Jennifer, and yeah, great, thanks. We're at the next slide already. I think along with convening expert panels and crowdsourcing feedback, we're looking at NIA and NIH more broadly at how we can use our unique role to facilitate and promote recruitment and help move that along. And so we want to emphasize that it's not just our job to do this, and it's not just your job, but coming together to play each the unique role that we have in the recruitment and retention space. So here, as you see on this slide, are some things that we're thinking about that we can do in our unique role as a government agency and lead funder of research to boost recruitment. And we're hoping that this recruitment strategy that we're finalizing this summer will just be sort of the starting point, that it will prompt implementation plans and future collaborations. And it's why we're so excited to be in dialogue with you today and hope to continue to look at ways that we can collaborate together to move recruitment forward. So in our role, we, of course, would convene and facilitate. I think we would look at grant mechanisms and programmatic enhancements like instituting grant application requirements to better support review and planning for recruitment. And that's now supported by the new NIH inclusion policy that specifically requires participation by women and racial and ethnic groups as folks are submitting clinical trials grant applications. So that enforces the need to plan ahead for how you might recruit at the site level for that sort of trial. We can also, in our role, help to continue to identify barriers and creatively problem solve and hopefully bring in collaborators who can help solve some of the barriers that we see across multiple studies. So we can have that 1,000-foot view and think about how we can use grant policy and requirements to better address those challenges. And of course, we're very interested in providing, also convening and providing access to best practices and resources. So we're developing a recruitment repository where investigators and study sites can find resources to get potential participants in the door. So at this point, we've collected a lot of best practices from our Alzheimer's disease centers and are working to get that online so it's available publicly for all kinds of study sites across the board to be able to use. So we're not always continuously reinventing the wheel. And I think the other component of that is making folks aware of other government resources that are available. So, for example, NCAT at NIH, the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, has developed a recruitment innovation center and a trial innovation network, and they're working very hard also on a broad level to make translational research more tuned into recruitment issues and to develop a science of recruitment. And finally, I think we have a role to play in doing targeted outreach, bridging the gap between various communities, including the clinical care community, and developing outreach and tools and information that we can get out to clinicians and community organizations and communities through digital and other platforms to promote research participation. So that's what our wheelhouse is in this whole process. And we will, of course, continue to convene and seek feedback as we move forward into implementation. Next slide, please. So as part of those efforts, we're, as Melissa mentioned, looking to develop the science of recruitment. For those of you who know our director, Richard Hodis, is an evidence-based guy, as we all are at NIH. And so testing and implementing evidence-based recruitment practices is high on our list. And so this new funding opportunity that you see on this slide, examining diversity, recruitment, and retention in aging research, kind of grew out of that desire to have to develop an evidence base for recruitment strategies and to be able to test those out. So this is an exciting opportunity in that it encourages building collaborative teams at the community level to target gaps in recruitment and retention methods and outcomes. So you can go to this blog post that you see on the right and get more detail, but I just wanted to bring it to your attention as a way to collaborate within communities, develop teams, and provide support to community organizations to engage in the recruitment process. So we're really looking for projects that will develop and evaluate innovative approaches to recruitment and retention, that will test those new approaches and disseminate the methodology to the field. We want to have projects that will engage, educate, and motivate community members to participate in research, facilitate their enrollment, and demonstrate measurable success. And then I think we want to look at strategies that incorporate community members and patient or volunteer liaisons into the recruitment infrastructure. How can we do that at study sites and enable them to be active partners? And I think that grows directly out of what we heard from IdeaScale, that particularly folks who have previously participated in research are willing to serve as ambassadors for the research and recruitment process. How can we incorporate their voices and testimonials into the recruitment process? And finally, the goal of this funding opportunity is at the local level to develop a cohort of people in the community who are engaged and ready to participate in Alzheimer's research. And in fact, this particular FOA, although we've been touting it for Alzheimer's research, it's really across all aging research. So I think it really is engaging the community to participate in research on a broad scale. Next slide, please. The other recent initiative that I wanted to bring to your attention is the Alzheimer's Clinical Trial Consortium. This is what we call our next-gen clinical trials infrastructure. It's a consortium of 35 sites across the U.S., and the trials that this network runs will be individually funded by NIA. So this is really the infrastructure that will manage those trials. And of particular note, as part of the establishment of this new infrastructure, there was a focus on recruitment, including the formation of a minority outreach and recruitment team that will develop and test innovations in recruitment to support partnerships with diverse communities. So we're really excited about having this in place, and we hope that the ACTC experts in infrastructure will support the design and conduct of trials across the full spectrum of Alzheimer's and related dementias, and that they will be able to develop and implement cutting-edge participant recruitment and retention strategies, especially in diverse populations, as part of their work. Next slide, and you can read more at the URL there. And so rounding out our part of the conversation, of course, we really appreciate the opportunity to share our strategies and the activities we've been undertaking, but we also need your voices particularly, and want to make sure that the strategy that we're developing incorporates the challenges and strategies you all are facing and incorporating. So what challenges are you facing specifically in industry clinical trials? Are those different than other trials? What strategies have you undertaken? I think a common challenge for all of us is how to engage healthcare providers better in the recruitment and research enterprise, and how can we collaborate? And so next slide, please. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you today. Here's our contact information for Melissa and myself, and thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing from all of you about your interesting questions.
Thank you, Jennifer and Melissa. That was a terrific presentation. Next, I would like to introduce Phyllis Farrell, who is Vice President of Global Alzheimer's Disease Team at Eli Lilly. Many of you may know Phyllis, or you may have seen her in the documentary Turning Point that takes us inside the quest for the first medication to treat the underlying process of Alzheimer's disease. Phyllis is a graduate of DePaul and received her MBA from Stanford University. She's been with Lilly for more than 20 years and has held many leadership roles throughout the organization. She was recognized with the Rising Star Award from the Healthcare Businesswomen's Association. She is a member of the World Dementia Council and serves on numerous boards. Phyllis, thanks for joining us, and please take it away from here.
Hi, thanks everybody, and that was a very nice introduction. Too nice. In fact, probably it's just as important is that I lost my daddy and my father-in-law to Alzheimer's disease. So I'm in this with a lot of personal commitment as well as professional. But thank you very much, and thanks for having me and hosting the call. We're proud sponsors of ACT-AD. So are you guys going to manage the slides from your side if I say next slide?
Yes, we can do that, Phyllis. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's go ahead and kick it off. I specifically appreciated the NIH presentation, and certainly, obviously, we have a long-standing relationship there as well, and all the efforts that are going on, especially, looking at outreach even in underserved populations. I think that some of the information I might share here may be a little bit depressing, but we're going to go ahead and give it a go and see if it helps us brainstorm solutions. So next slide, please. Oh, this is the disclaimer that basically says I'm not doing anything promotional. Okay, next slide, thanks. I think it's important, and if you hit click, I think this is animated, it may or may not work for you, but today's practice, oh yeah, the animation won't work, just leave it there. Today's practice of Alzheimer's disease is very, very late. And if you ask someone about someone with Alzheimer's disease in the community or even a physician, in their mind, they conjure up an 80-plus-year-old female who's in a rocking chair in the corner in a long-term care facility. And that's where the mindset is when you use the word Alzheimer's disease today. On the other hand, the science is showing us that we need to go early and earlier and, in fact, start talking about healthy aging and brain health. Next slide. And so what that leaves for us is a real conundrum as it relates to how diagnosis is done in our healthcare system and the clinical trial paradigm. So one of the real challenges in clinical trials is if you look at that top yellow line, that's what you might call healthy aging. And then, of course, the line that you see go down like a roller coaster with the blue and the red is the Alzheimer's disease progression. And what will happen is someone will come in to their doctor's office and they'll say, you know, I think something's wrong with my memory. And today, the doctor will say, well, let's give it a year and see what happens. And so the doctors are using time and this progression to make a decision as to whether there's a diagnosis or not. And what they're saying in their minds is, well, if this person stays stable, then it's probably not Alzheimer's disease. It's probably, you know, depression or drug-drug interaction or something else. But if I see this steep decline, then I can now diagnose Alzheimer's disease. Or probable Alzheimer's disease, as I think everyone knows, there's no requirement for pathology today. And we know from clinical trials that, you know, even with hours and hours of cognitive testing, our best investigators are wrong at least 25% of the time in mild Alzheimer's disease and 50% of the time when you get to the prodromal disease. So as a result, the current healthcare practice doesn't actually encourage a diagnosis happening at a time where we could intervene either from clinical research or ultimately at a time when a drug might be approved. Next slide, please. So we use something at Lilly, it's not unusual from pharma companies, to talk about the patient journey and how does the patient wind their way through what's a very complicated healthcare system in U.S. and honestly in other countries as well, and even more for Alzheimer's disease. So we've used this methodology to understand both how patients work through the healthcare system in general, but also how they ultimately get to one of our clinical trial sites. So first, a person has to have some sort of awareness that there's something going wrong. Right now I'm talking about a symptomatic patient. Then they have to go seek treatment, and they have to seek treatment in the right place. They have to receive a timely diagnosis. Ultimately, they'll have to get an advanced diagnostic, either at their site of care or in their clinical trial, and then treatment here could be looked at as a clinical trial. So Lilly's been doing Alzheimer's disease late phase research for about 10 years now. Over the past 10 years, we have screened over 32,000 people in phase 2 and 3 in studies, and we've randomized over 16,000 people in phase 2 and 3 studies. So that gives you, on average, about 3,200 patients screened a year, 1,600 patients randomized a year. If you divide that roughly in half, assuming the U.S. is about half of your trial population, you're looking at randomizing roughly 800 patients a year in the U.S. And that includes a time when we were enrolling Expedition 3, which had very light inclusion criteria, well, in Expedition 1 and 2 and identity studies for semagacestat, which didn't even have amyloid inclusion criteria. And when Expedition 3 was enrolling, it was not a very competitive clinical trial enrollment space like it is right now. What we know is that this mindset of late, Alzheimer's being a very late disease, and that whole awareness bucket starts right away at siphoning off all of your potential patients. And in fact, we know that only about 10% of people with Alzheimer's disease are what we call treatment seekers. Those patients tend to be very affluent and very educated. And so right away, you have knocked out 90% of your population and the majority of your underserved patients. And then when they talk to a primary care physician, the primary care physician is often very disconnected from the clinical trial infrastructure. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to share with you a couple of pieces of data, both from the Europe and the U.S. This data is available to you through, in this case, the Alzheimer's Europe Value of Knowing Survey. And so what you'll see is across 5 large countries here that while north of 50 to 80% of people with Alzheimer's disease, and these were surveyed, were those that were what we would call caregivers. So they are the most involved in the financial support and decision-making of the day-to-day care of someone with Alzheimer's, that while they say they would be interested in receiving that information, they actually are not seeking information. So this corresponds what we see with about 10% of people being information seekers. Next slide. This is from the Alzheimer's Disease International World Alzheimer's Report, another one that's available publicly. And what it shows is that there's actually an opportunity to diagnose much earlier, but today we're diagnosing it what's labeled here as T4, which is at the time of disability and when a caregiver or a family finally can no longer deny anymore that something is going on. Next slide, please. And then this is from the Alzheimer's Association Facts and Figures report, a lot of rich data in that report. This is specifically talking about disclosure rate in the U.S. And what you see is you look at basically every other major healthcare condition, diabetes, arthritis, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and you're looking at 70 to 80%, 90% disclosure rates. When you look at dementia, you're looking at on average, even after the time the doctor has made a diagnosis, the patient is only told about 30% of the time. Next slide, please. This is an interesting study that was done by Adelphi that looks at, and it doesn't build, so I'll kind of walk you through it, but let's start with the U.S. line. It walks through patients that have MCI or prodromal Alzheimer's disease. So these are patients that have cognitive symptoms, but you do not yet have any functional disability. And this is what the doctors have coded their diagnosis. Adelphi went in and did a 3-way case call. They did a case review of the medical file. They talked to the doctor and did an interview with the patient. What they found in the U.S. is that 55% of those people that were identified as having no dementia, they had prodromal or MCI, that actually 55% of them had an MMSE between 20 and 26 and actually had mild dementia. In Japan, where you see the stigma even being higher, you've got 67% of the people that were identified as having mild cognitive impairment actually were into the dementia phase. You see Germany. And in the UK, we thought we were doing a little bit better because it was only 40%, but then we found that 20% of those patients actually had moderate dementia and had an MMSE of 10 to 19, and yet they were coded in their primary care physician's office as someone that had mild cognitive impairment or prodromal disease. Next slide, please. So I think the critical piece of the summary here is that this is the patient journey is difficult in every disease state, but specifically in Alzheimer's disease, it's even more challenging. And what we found is that as it relates to recruiting into clinical trials, bricks and mortar solutions, what I call kind of hard-coded solutions like registries and things like that, they don't tend to have as much of a positive effect as you might see unless you're talking about a very specific patient like the dyad patient. And instead, what has been much more helpful are things that are community-based, conversations that are happening in communities. There's some good examples in Minnesota, the Essentia example there. In Georgia, they had a community conversation several years ago that's now delivered a $5 million line item called the Georgia Alzheimer's Plan. You can see things like Recognition Health, which was in the UK, now in the US. They do outreach in churches and book clubs and are just a massive recruiter for Alzheimer's studies. And like Brain Health Matters in Florida, they don't talk about Alzheimer's disease. because as soon as they start talking about Alzheimer's disease, they conjure up this mindset of this very, very late patient. They talk about brain health, and they're able to get people to have a conversation a lot earlier. There's pilots like the one that's being run in Kansas by GAP that I think are going to be good to learn from. Eventually, they'll need to become self-funding, but once again, these are places where they're actually spending time talking with communities about how they're providing care for individuals and how patients are flowing through their major healthcare systems. I think the other important point, and I'll kind of close on this one, is that all politics are local, and in the U.S., all healthcare systems are local. And so far we're finding that either global or even national solutions are not very effective because what works in Boston won't work in Indianapolis. They're different players that are at the table. And the ADRC or ADC network, while very valued in terms of delivering research, is not very well integrated into their local communities. There's very few doctors that you talk to who are seeing our potential patients who even know what an ADRC is or know that they have one in their community. And so one of the things that I think pharma companies really, really need help with, and why we think this collaboration is so important, is that other people can do this disease state education and this scientific education better than we can. We can educate or recruit for a specific trial. We can discuss, an Expedition 3 study or something along those lines, but we can't as easily have that broad conversation about the basic science and memory changes and brain health that is necessary locally. It's a little bit of struggle even to do this through advocacy because the two main advocacy organizations actually use Alzheimer's in their name. So the Alzheimer's Association and Us Against Alzheimer's, wonderful, wonderful organizations, but by definition, they conjure up a much later patient that our participants don't identify themselves with. And so one of the things that I would ask the group to consider is, do we need to be thinking about more community-based approaches that help local communities in some of our greatest metropolitan areas really understand how patients are flowing through their system. Okay, I'll pause there and I think move to the next speaker if that's the next flow I think I've got right.
Oh, great. Thank you, Phyllis. That was wonderful. I'd now like to introduce Kate Wilson, who is the Associate Director in Global Clinical Operations at Biogen. She works on the Feasibility, Enrollment, and Retention Optimization team at Biogen, which focuses on patient engagement and patient recruitment and retention for Biogen's clinical trials. Kate has a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of New Hampshire, and for the past 16 years at Biogen, she's worked in many roles and groups within global clinical operations across various therapeutic areas. We feel very fortunate to be hearing from you today, and with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Missy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, great.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So thank you so much. I want to thank ACTAD and the NIA for this opportunity to participate in this webinar and participate in this important discussion on how we can strategize and better enhance and accelerate recruitment and retention of our AD clinical trials. If you want to go to the next slide there, I think it is next slide as well. My disclaimer as well, that these are my views and not necessarily those of Biogen. Next slide, please. So these were really, I guess, the areas that were posed to us during this webinar for discussion. So there's 5 questions really that I'll look to address. Really, what are our challenges for recruitment that Biogen's experienced? What have we done to overcome them? How do we measure success for recruitment of different initiatives and tactics we've taken? Ways that we can contribute to the science of recruitment, and then how can we better collaborate across the industry in our efforts together for recruitment. So we can jump to the next slide. So just to give you just an intro, maybe just a high-level overview of Biogen's strategic focus, for how we approach clinical trial recruitment. And it's truly this cross-functional collaborative approach that we've taken. We work with representatives from different functions, so clinical operations, patient advocacy, medical, public affairs, and, we draw on our areas of expertise. We look for, furthering relationships both internally and externally with vendors, with partners, really to identify and execute on these innovative tactics. How can we leverage these partnerships, technology, data to support and enhance our patient recruitment? Our overall goal, I think the industry's goal here really is, how can we make these studies available earlier and more feasibly available for patients and their loved ones. On the right-hand side here, you'll see kind of our 4 strategic pillars that really guide our strategy. We're trying to meet patients and families where they are, so we need to be where they are and provide and educate, support them, on what is a clinical trial, what is AD, what are those early signs and symptoms. We look to really strengthen our relationships and partnerships with what we're calling our external influencers. So these are the doctors, the physicians, the specialists, the nurses who are seeing these patients and these families, talking with them at those earlier stages. When we talk about participation in the challenges, it's that patient engagement. We need to create an enhanced and optimal experience for these patients and loved ones. And overall, we need to adopt the strategy of, we need to think globally. These are large global clinical trials, but we have to act locally. We need to customize for cultures, for regions, regulatory, requirements. We need to understand at a site level, how do our sites operate? How do they recruit best? What don't they want to do? What do they want to do more of? It's critical that we execute at that local level. You can do next slide, please. Really trying to touch maybe on some of the key challenges. This webinar today, we've, I think, highlighted many of the challenges that, Biogen as well has experienced. Phyllis talked nicely about this problem with, we're enrolling earlier populations, yet standard of care has not led us to that earlier diagnosis. So this is challenging to identify, the participants needed for these trials. We're dealing with that stigma of AD, the feeling that there's, some patients think that, this may be a normal process of aging, or there's that stigma as well of, there is something wrong, but I don't want to make this a reality because I don't think there's much available. We talked a bit about the lack of the physician, awareness and referral, and we know from, some recently published studies and surveys, so the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, found that through surveying physicians and nurses, that while they're willing to refer patients to clinical trials, it's not being done, and the reasons for that really is that, they don't have the information readily accessible. They don't know what the trials are, where they're being run. They don't have the time to look into that. So we have this gap where we're not referring early enough. And then you think of the sites and the patients that are coming their way and the burden for the sites on pre-screening, on recruitment. A lot of the tactics that we offer to them, they might increase the number of referrals to their sites, which we think is great, but do they have the capacity, to really manage that? Do they have the resources, the time? They're up against high screen failure rates as it is. They're establishing these new patients. We know from talking with sites that, a new patient to them, it can take several months before they even discuss the clinical trial because they are building that relationship. They're diagnosing. That trust with that patient takes time before they talk about a clinical trial. And once you're at that stage, you are talking about clinical trials with the patients, with their loved ones. They too are up against, it's very difficult for them to even qualify for the trial. Once they qualify, it's the question of, is this something I want, to partake in? Is this something that my family can take on? It's the extreme burden of the patient, of the loved one, bringing them to and from the visits. There's lengthy studies, there's monthly visits. How are they going to fit this into their lives? And talking about those visits and what's being done, we know that there is this, lack of understanding of some of these, procedures that are very routine in our trials for us, but something that's, new and scary to others. Lumbar punctures, MRIs, PET imaging, we've learned through insights that, these aren't well understood procedures, and we think there's a real link between it not being well understood and therefore lack of interest in participating. So that's a real challenge. And again, the global approach, but needing to really customize these for different regions and for our sites is a challenge, and time and costly. Next slide. So what are we, doing about this at Biogen? Here you'll see some, larger areas that we've focused on for some of our clinical trials as ways to really accelerate the enrollment process. So we're really looking at, driving qualified patients to our sites, but we know that, patients are finding information in various ways. So we really need to meet the patients where they are, and this requires a multi-channeled approach. Looking at advertising in digital, we have standard traditional advertising, but we have this digital space where we know that these patients and their caregivers, they are going online, they are on social media. So we do a lot of research to find out where are they, what are they looking for, what are they typing in for a search. We advertise on those areas. We have built public-facing websites for our studies where we provide information about clinical trials. We provide information about our recruiting trials. We have developed these, I think, more patient-friendly, customer-friendly pre-screeners where you can complete a pre-screener and identify who you're completing it for, and it kind of guides you through a series of questions, eligibility criteria, but it's letting you know along the way why we're asking these questions. So it's not something that's scary or unknown. It's a warmer experience. At the end, they receive a report on how they answered those questions. So regardless of if they refer to a clinical trial, that's something that they can have available. They can print that out. They can talk to family. They can talk to their doctor with something, here's what, I may be concerned about. So that's been helpful for sites. We think we're delivering through that digital channel some higher quality patients to our sites. In addition to the, standard physician referral channel, we are working with other companies, other vendors, health screening companies. These groups are, conducting health events, brain health events in our communities within the areas of our clinical trials. They are offering cognitive screening or health tests, brain health tests to, again, arrive at, predict potentially that MCI, that early AD patient, and doing more of a warm transfer over to our clinical trial sites. Disease awareness, we have our Notes to Remember disease awareness campaign, where that's really, the efforts there is really to, again, educate, build awareness, but at that earlier stage. So kind of invoke that call to action earlier to do something, to talk to your doctor, to find out more about clinical trials. Patient education and awareness has been a significant contributor to our recruitment. This is where sites really, truly get involved with their community. They really own this. We support sites with their efforts for community outreach. They're really establishing a relationship and building respect and trust within their community, which has really resulted in, some good quality patients for them. And site engagement overall is just critical. Again, we need to learn from the sites what they want to do. We need to support them. So we do provide recruitment advances to our sites as part of their, their study budget contract with us, and this really allows them to really kind of own and be empowered, advertise locally, seek, further support from us. It gives them that leverage to do what works best for them. Next slide, please. So looking specifically at the retention piece, it's, when we think of retention, what we're really talking about here is what is the experience for a patient, for their loved one throughout the journey of the clinical trial. It's how are we engaging with them? Is this an optimal experience? So we gather, I think number one here is, in order to continue to provide that optimal experience, we need to listen to the patient, continue to gather insights, from beginning to end, from caregivers as well. So we've recently conducted a patient focus group with patients and caregivers actually, and a larger online survey with caregivers to get some feedback on, what are the challenges and barriers to participation in a clinical trial, feedback on study design and so forth. So number one across the board, we've heard travel support is critical. So that is an area where, we need to be supporting the patients and the caregivers and getting to and from these visits. We've heard feedback on, some of our own trials where, it would not have been feasible for these patients to remain in the study had it not been for the support services that we provide. So these are vendors that, provide car service or booking, other forms of travel, hotel stays, depending on how far they are, as well as stipends for participating. So a lot of the feedback from surveys and our focus groups has been, what is the reimbursement for me as the caregiver or the patient? So again, I think the industry is really changing here. These are no longer nice to have. These are really needed support mechanisms for our participants. Study information and education, not only at the beginning but throughout, is critical. So again, really helping that individual to address what does the study involve, what is a lumbar puncture, what is a PET scan. These are ways that the caregivers can really take that information back to family members, because we know too that it's a family approach for that decision to participate in a clinical trial, and they need that information. We've created animations that are really helpful and another way of presenting information. So we've created animations about clinical trials, about placebo effects, about our specific studies as well. And ongoing engagement with individuals. So we know patients and caregivers, they seek information. They want to know what they're involved in. So we have created patient newsletters, which allow us to, have that, two-way communication, provide information about the studies, interviews with a Biogen scientist who's been involved in, the earlier stages of the drug development, interviews with some of our site staff as well. So allowing us to continue to provide that information is critical, and appreciate as well. So thank you cards and milestone certificates along the way, those things that just really do, it's little effort really, but it goes a long way. And again, critical the site engagement, so that we continue to hear and listen to what their needs are, and we not only on the patient side but the site side, and we kind of redirect as we go. Next slide, please. So just quickly here, looking at how does Biogen, really measure our recruitment efforts. It was interesting for us as we look to see where our referrals are coming from. It's interesting to know, around 40% of our referrals, while coming from the site's database or their already existing networks of referrals from physicians, that the majority are actually coming from externally. So again, really drives home that we do need to offer the support to the site, in finding new patients, and that, we need to address those challenges. Ways that we're looking at additional, specific, how is the performance of individual tactics. So site feedback, again, is critical, but also looking at pre-screening logs where you can see, an early indicator of where are these sites finding their patients? Are they screening through? Are these screen failures? Are there ways that we can help them focus on the ones that have been successful? And then looking at that funnel, really, of the referral outcome, of those numbers referred to the sites, how many screens failed, using a lot of our digital data to drive some of that, looking to see at website visits, bounce rates, how long they stayed on pages. So there's various ways that we're really kind of slicing the data and looking at the performance. Next slide, please. So the last couple of slides here is just to really address those questions, I think, of how we can contribute to science and collaborate better. I think number one here, just to drive home, is really the patient insights, the caregiver insights, incorporated from beginning to end, and really ensuring that your study endpoints are something that's meaningful, that's tied back to the patient and their loved ones, and not just what, you know, the regulators are asking. So to really challenge that area. Looking at that digital space again, there's so much big data that we can be looking at. Committing to a minimum set of criteria for supporting sites and patients. So rather than doing this at a, you know, study by study level, looking at across as the AD franchise, you know, how should we be supporting, and what does that look like as a standard? And then really leveraging groups, you know, like ACTAD and the NIA and other advocacy groups, foundations as well, patient advocates, you know, they're influencers, you know, so much data out there that we can really be leveraging, I think, to really improve and identify the most optimal ways of recruitment. Next slide, please. And lastly, I'll just land with this. You know, for collaborating, it's this opportunity, it's many others. You know, I think we need to continue to work together. The notion of rising waters lifts all boats. You know, we are truly all in this together for patients, number one. So I appreciate this opportunity to share with you all, and I think that I've run us over time, so I will stop there. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. That was wonderful. I appreciate it. We have gone over a few minutes. I don't know if folks are able to stay on for maybe 5 more minutes and answer questions.
Yes,
I'm happy to stay.
Okay. So one question that we had was, and I'd like to start with Jennifer and Melissa. If you had a magic wand, what would you want the advocacy community to do to promote clinical trials?
This is Jennifer. That's a really good question, and I think it points back to what Kate was just ending on, that I think collaboration at the local level is key here, and working together to coordinate our parts and create that tide that lifts all of our boats. I'm keenly aware after seeing these 2 presentations that Lilly and Biogen are really engaged with healthcare providers in a way that we haven't been able to be. And so I think we each touch our communities in a different way. The federal government is what it is. And so I really would ask advocacy organizations to help us convene and collaborate and work together, particularly at the local level.
Wonderful, great. I'd like to extend that same question to our industry partners. Is there anything that the advocacy community can do to promote the clinical trials that y'all have underway?
This is Phyllis. I think, we've already got some really great relationships with the advocacy, leading Alzheimer's advocacy groups. I feel really good about those. I think the place that I think we just really need to knuckle down, and I know it's hard, and I know it's not tangible, and I know that people feel like it's an uphill battle, is we have got to get cognitive screening into the annual Medicare wellness visit. If we just did that, and you grew our number from 10% of people to being seekers to 20%, you double the population. And right now we have an annual Medicare wellness visit that's only used 30% of the time, and it's sufficient to say, how's your memory? That's not okay, and we know that, right? So I think that alone, and probably all the things that would follow behind that, as soon as that happens, now you have, physician training going in place, you have quality metrics going around it, all of those kinds of things. And then that benefits not just clinical trial participants, but that benefits the entire healthcare system, because we know that families and caregivers patients aren't getting the support they need as soon as they could. So that to me is a really, really big one. And it feels like it'd be something that would be very measurable and tangible for us to say that we did, is just getting a cognitive screen mandated in the annual Medicare wellness visit and start holding people accountable to making sure that we're really treating the brain as the fifth vital sign. I think there's a lot of folks that think we need to go around primary care physicians because they've found that they're not helpful. But the problem is a 60-year-old, 65-plus-year-old individual, they want their primary care physician to endorse what they're doing. And so going around them isn't really making the whole system better. If I had to wave a magic wand, that's what I would hope for.
Okay, that's great feedback. Any other thoughts on?
Yeah, this is Kate from Biogen. So I guess just to add to that, I would love to see how we could work better with advocacy on, building out that patient voice. So patient ambassadors, we know that they do want to share their experience, but I don't think we use that or take as much advantage of that. So how could we, build that out more, make it easier and more acceptable for patients to talk with each other, to be almost a study buddy in a sense, I think would be really nice.
That's good feedback. I had a question. Has the new FDA clinical guidance on early Alzheimer's disease changed the discussions for you within industry about how you're conducting future trials?
This is Phyllis. Not particularly. I think the FDA, we were always having kind of our own confidential one-on-one conversations with the FDA. We've been doing it for a very long time, and they've always been a very, very active, engaged, willing partner. And I think the guidance is really reflecting what we had been talking about behind those closed doors. So I don't think there's anything really changing from a clinical trial perspective. It's good, once again, to have that be a public statement because I think it gets attention that way. But I don't think there's anything there was anything there that was a huge change. In one aspect, it gives a little bit of a cop-out because and when you look at that combined with the biomarker paper, the NIAA guidelines, which says all biomarkers are for research purposes only, that doesn't help us when we really are encouraging a timely, accurate diagnosis, but at least it's starting the conversation. Kay, I don't know if Biogen feels differently.
No, I would agree with that, Phyllis.
Hey guys, it's Sue Peshin. I just had 3 quick things that I just really appreciated the last couple comments. The first for Phyllis around the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. I'm sure you're aware, but maybe not all the people tuning in, that AHRQ and USPSTF put out its final research plan. They're in the process of reevaluating that screening recommendation. And for anybody that's a part of ACT-AD or wants to get connected to us, let us know because we've been weighing in on that. And I think it would be terrific for as many groups as possible, including the companies that are interested, to weigh in on that process as it moves along. So that's number one. And we'd love as ACT-AD to be sort of a convener around that and help with that, in whatever way we can. The second is that we actually have a PCORI engagement project for a senior patient and family and caregiver network and have several incredible patient ambassadors, some of whom are part of active clinical trials, others who want to get involved that have Alzheimer's disease, and also family and caregivers that are very interested in also figuring out how to mobilize to get physicians to talk about the importance of getting involved in research. So this is another area that's really interesting to us and we think has huge possibilities, especially within CMS, to see if there's an existing code or something we can do on this to help provide an incentive. And then last, we just really want to make sure that this dialogue between NIA and the 2 of your companies, as well as other companies that are a part of ACT-AD, stay in communication and just continue this talk, because I think that that's really how change happens. And, you know, I'm sure NIA has things they can learn from all the companies, and the companies are going to have things that they can learn as, you know, Melissa and Jennifer move along in their work. And so we'll just connect all of you after the call, but are happy to also, you know, kind of create opportunities to continue this dialogue, because this is such important work. So thank you all so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity today.
Okay, I'd really like to thank all of our speakers for the insightful presentations, as well as taking the time to answer some of our questions. Again, I'd like to thank our ACT-AD sponsors, Anavex, Avenir, Axovant, Biogen, ISI, Eli Lilly and Company, Genentech, Janssen, Lundbeck, Merck, and Otsuka. We'll have a recording of the webinar available in the next week or two for any of your colleagues to view as well. Thank you all for your time today, and I hope you have a great day.